This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. In our final virtual Defence and Security Studies evening for the 2023 spring season, Persian-American writer and activist Mariam Memarsadeghi discussed the situation faced by Iran's women under a repressive regime.
So good evening, everyone, and others will be joining online, I'm sure, in the next few minutes. I'm Dr. Daniel Eustace. I'm the Director of the Defense and Security Studies Program at the Royal Canadian Military Institute, and really happy to have you join us this evening for the June Defense and Security Studies Program speaker event. We are extremely privileged to have with us tonight Mariam Memarsadeghi, who is joining us from Washington. So Miriam, welcome. As I said earlier in our discussion, please feel free to contact me anytime you want to come and visit the RCMI in person, and we'll happily set that up. I think you would enjoy it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, that's great. We didn't have a speaker event per se in April. We had a conference. It was a very well attended conference in April, focused on Ukraine. No surprise there. And last month I was involved with the Conference of Defense Associations Institute graduate student contest. Really, it was a competition, and that was a wonderful event as well. And certainly over the last several months, we have obviously all had our eyes on what's going on in Ukraine, and I think this is understandable. But I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of other critical issues and events that are occurring in other parts of the world. And I have an interest in what is happening in Iran, because I think Iran is such an important country that we need to make sure that we have some understanding. And I just saw 4 days ago, I saw an article that started off talking about women in Iran are defying fresh attempts by authorities to use technology to enforce the compulsory dress code that has been a focus of continuing protests across the country. In April, National Police Chief, I won't go mention his name, announced the launch of a, quote, SMART program involving surveillance cameras to identify women failing to cover their hair or wear loose-fitting clothing in public despite the threat of fines or imprisonment. He warned that those caught breaking the hijab law for a second time would be referred to courts, and that cars carrying female passengers with uncovered hair would be confiscated, and that businesses turning a blind eye would be closed. However, his announcement provoked derisive responses on social media, with women posting photos and videos of themselves not wearing the hijab in public spaces across the country. So, these protests, which really flared up some time ago as a result of a young woman being killed, and I'm not going to get into that because this is Miriam's area of expertise, and she's probably going to talk about that. But these protests are ongoing, and it really speaks to the state of democracy in Iran. So let me introduce Miriam. I know some of you perhaps have seen this bio, but I want to do it because she's well deserving of this introduction. So Miriam is a leading proponent for a democratic Iran. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, American Interest, Jerusalem Post, Tablet, Bulwark, Kiet, and other publications. I asked her what she was spending most of her time doing recently, and she's done it surprisingly. She came back and said, I'm doing analysis, and I'm doing writing, and I'm speaking. She's a frequent speaker at universities and think tanks worldwide and multilingual media. She's the founder and director of the Cyrus Forum, and we're hoping that she's going to tell us more about that. It works to aid a peaceful and durable transition to democracy in Iran through a multi-stakeholder collaborative process. She's also the co-founder of Tavana, e-learning institute for Iranian civil society. This was launched in 2010. The virtual institute is now a household brand throughout Iran, offering secure democracy and human rights educational opportunities. The sister initiative to that, Tavana Tech, provides internet freedom, digital safety, and tech literacy to millions of Iranians. Miriam previously directed the Middle East and North Africa division at Freedom House, and immediately after the NATO bombing of Kosovo and Serbia, worked for nearly 3 years in the Baltic region, Balkan region, I'm sorry, for the International Rescue Committee, which is a very well-known organization, and the International Organization for Migration. She was a 2017 Presidential Leadership Scholar and has a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Dickinson College. Miriam migrated from Iran to the United States, where she is living in Washington. She did so at the age of 7 during the 1979 revolution. So Miriam, it's a great honor that we have you here. It's a great privilege, and we look forward to your presentation. And so, Miriam, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll begin by talking about what I think a lot of people have seen, if not everyone who has interest and is watching this program have seen covered by the mainstream media, which is the widespread protests following the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini. It's been many months now, and it's been a heartbreaking but very cathartic, very powerful, and continuing to be very powerful revolution for democracy in Iran. So what happened to Mahsa Amini could have happened to any Iranian woman or girl. And that's in fact why I think it was so galvanizing to all of Iranian society, because although it was a very brutal and senseless and evil act to beat an innocent girl's head until she goes into a coma and then dies, it is an act that continues to torment and terrorize the Iranian population, women and the men who are in their lives and love them, and has done so since the 1979 revolution. Prior to the 1979 revolution, Iranian women and girls dressed as they chose. And there was a real diversity of appearance, particularly in Iranian cities. Many women, if not the vast majority really in Tehran and other large cities, walked unveiled. They wore mini skirts. They were very active in all parts of the economy. They were pursuing advanced degrees. They were serving as judges. They were serving as ministers. They were serving as ambassadors. They themselves led the way for Iranian girls and women to have rights on par with Western societies in many ways. And it was a transformation of a society that less than 100 years ago was really undeveloped, and girls and women particularly had no place in the public sphere. So it was a transformation overnight, practically, of taking the women who had made vast and truly profound strides forward in terms of their rights, in terms of their dignity, in terms of their social power, their opportunities, and pushing them back into the home, denying them professions such as Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, being denied her profession of being a judge, denied political power, really taken back into the home. And when they did come out in public, when they went to school, kindergarten onwards, forced to veil in a very strict way, to cover their bodies, the rest of their bodies, to have to wear dark colored socks, to be denied mixing of sexes, so girls from a very young age, from kindergarten onwards, not able to go to school or socialize with boys, and almost any part of society that you can think of, from buses to public buildings, any place segregated. Women were denied entry to many different kinds of academic fields, denied entry into sports stadiums, denied the right to sing, denied the right to play many sports, denied the right to be themselves as women and girls. And of course, this is part and parcel to a larger Islamist ideology that is totalitarian. So it's not as though it's only women and girls in Iran who are being oppressed. Because it is a totalitarian regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran really denies the most basic of freedoms, freedom of expression, such that people are feeling free to talk only inside the home. And even in the 1980s and 1990s, even in the home, people may have felt afraid to express themselves. They were not in the 80s and 90s able to access a lot of media. So there were bootleg VHS tapes, and anyone who had them and anyone who rented them risked lashings and imprisonment just because they were watching a foreign movie, for example. So this is the backdrop to the Woman Life Freedom Revolution, and it is really a transformation of Iranian society, but one that is well seated, if you will, because prior to this round of widespread protests and widespread strikes, labor strikes, there have been many more acts of nonviolent civil disobedience and widespread dissent. So particularly at the end of 2017, early 2018, protests broke out in over 100 cities. And keep in mind, this is when the JCPOA nuclear deal was still in effect, and the Iranian people were supposed to be benefiting from the largesse of that nuclear deal. Economically, their lives were supposed to improve, as John Kerry had promised, and the foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, had promised. Not only did that not happen, also their human rights, which were supposed to expand and improve, the people were being repressed as much, if not more, than before the JCPOA was put into effect. So people came out with a lot of anger, and their slogan was Islah Talab Usulgara Dige Tamum Majara, which means hardliners and reformists, the game is over. So speaking directly to both the hardliners and the reformists with an anger and a resentment, saying, we are for complete regime change. So the call for regime change was being articulated in late 2017, and people were as angry, if not more, at the reformists than the hardliners, because the reformists had been delivering them lie after lie about promises after promises about improved livelihood. Even going back further, in 2009, the Green Movement, which erupted after a presidential election was perceived to have been fraudulent. You may remember the Green Movement had millions of people out on the streets in Tehran, silent marches, the kind of imagery that we associate with the colored revolutions that turn a society in Eastern Europe or other places from tyranny to democracy. It didn't happen. That revolution also was violently repressed. But even in that revolution, even in that Green Movement, which was much more of a intra-regime battle for power, because the presidential candidates Mousavi and Karoubi were handpicked by Khamenei, as all presidential candidates effectively are. And even though they represented the aspiration of millions of people on the streets, they themselves were regime insiders. And many people, including myself, believe that that movement did not succeed because its ostensible leadership, Mousavi and Karoubi, we're never going to break from the ruling structure of the regime. But even in 2009, even in that green movement, there were slogans on the streets being chanted by the Iranian people: death to the dictator, death to the Islamic Republic. And if we really want to take it back, we can take it back to the actual 1979 revolution. Just a few weeks after the start of the Khomeiniist or Islamist revolution in 1979, on March 5th, Iranian women, including my own mom, came out onto the streets for a few days to protest hijab, to protest Islamist rule, and very tragically, they were violently repressed. And for now over 4 decades, the Islamists have ruled over Iran, and with an ideology and a mode of operation which is really no different than the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan. It's just that our countries have different histories and have different political cultures, and the one may be seeming more backward than the other, but really the Islamic Republic of Iran has the same ideology. It engages in, and is doing so right now, very systemic mass torture, very systemic mass rape, including of children. So the Women Life Freedom Revolution, according to the regime's own estimate, most of the people on the streets, and in fact, most of the people in the prisons, were children, people under 18. And Amnesty International has documented how those under 18s, how those children have been systematically tortured and raped by the Islamic Republic. Keep in mind, all these atrocities, all this inhumanity and injustice is waged in the name of God, is waged in the name of Islam. So let me turn to the future, and the work that we do at the Cyrus Forum is focused on building readiness and capacity for transition from this totalitarian regime to a democratic government in Iran. And the reason that readiness is so important is because without a game plan, a regime like the Islamic Republic can make a peaceful and durable transition to democracy very difficult. And it can cause instability, it can cause conflict, it can cause greater human suffering, and it can even cause the reconsolidation of power, such that the same people and the same ruling structures come back, but under a different name. So we saw this with the Soviet Union. Although the Central and Eastern European states were able to successfully transition, for the most part, successfully transition from communism to democracy, in the Soviet Union itself, the Russian people had a very short-lived experience with democratic opening, and the Putin regime reconsolidated the oligarchs from the Soviet Union into a new repressive regime that on the surface does look and sound different, and it is more nationalistic and not communist, but in practice it is highly repressive and a very strong threat, very nefarious to international security. And of course, the Ukraine war, the war on Ukraine, is the most pronounced and current manifestation, but we've seen Putin do the same in Chechnya, in Syria, with Georgia, and could try to do what it's doing in Ukraine with other countries that border it, if we don't stop it. As you know, also the regime in Iran is coordinating closely with Putin's regime and coordinating closely with the Chinese Communist Party. The three regimes I think it's safe to say, leading the other authoritarian countries around the world, and their alliance is one that is against the values of the free world and the security of the free world, the way of life that we appreciate and cherish. And if we don't recognize their cooperation and counter it, if we don't unify as democracies, as countries that value liberalism and human dignity, then they will succeed to become even more and more powerful. Already transnational repression is a real threat. So activists living in Canada, in the United States, in Western nations are under a serious threat by these regimes and how they operate, their assassination attempts, intimidation, terrorizing, trying to lure activists and journalists back to Iran or back to the region where they are kidnapped and then taken to Iran. Already we see these regimes not afraid to do that, not afraid to take Westerners hostage in their countries and then demand ransom and demand other kinds of appeasement. But if we don't stop them, if we don't take them on in a unified manner, then those threats are only bound to escalate and become a significant obstacle, really, to maintaining our lives as free people living in the free world. After all, so many immigrants like myself come to the West because they seek to have a free life. They seek to have their lives protected, to have an understanding that their future is safe and free, to have opportunity. And if these regimes manage to permeate our institutions, our universities, our media, our social media, our politicians, government institutions, then our freedom is in peril. So I mentioned the work that Cyrus Forum does, building the capacity for a free future, beginning now, so that we are not in a situation where the regime has collapsed, but there's no plan in place, there's no preparedness, there's been no deliberation about the kind of institution building that's required. We have a focus in 3 areas. One is the political transition, one is the psychosocial rehabilitation and the environment that needs to be protected and really resuscitated if Iran is to have a viable future and not to have mass migration. And of course, the economics, really transforming from a rentier and corrupt economy to a free market, where innovation and free trade and enterprise are rewarded. An education system, of course, is the pillar, is what is the foundation to all 3 pillars, and what sustains democracy in the end. So why is this important to Canadians? Why should this be important to Canadians? At the very, very least, it's in Canada's self-interest. It's in the self-interest of any democracy in the world that a regime that very proudly and overtly promotes illiberalism and totalitarian rule not gain in power. Just as Western nations defeated the Nazis, defeated fascists, defeated communists, it's very important for the West to recognize that Islamist rule, Putin's rule, the Chinese Communist Party's rule are direct and very just as strong a threat to the future of freedom as communism and fascism were, just more insidious and perhaps less obvious, and for that reason all the more dangerous, in fact, I think. So at the very least, people living in Western democracies democracies across the globe should care to stop this regime, to honor the aspirations of the Iranian people, and support their movement for a democratic future, because the West will avoid the refugee flows that will come from instability from Iran. The West will avoid the terrorism threats that will only persist if the regime is in power. And the West will benefit from the economic trade and investment and scientific collaboration with Iran, which is a country that is bound to be one of the most flourishing if it is a free country. So, but beyond the self-interest in the areas that I described, I think it's our moral duty. Anyone living anywhere, if they are free, needs to help those who are not yet free. And the Iranian people, every single day, are making unbelievable sacrifices, going out onto the streets and risking bullets, risking torture, risking rape, making sure that those who have lost their children, their closest family, their people that their boyfriends, their girlfriends, their husbands, their wives, their moms, their dads, their children, neighbors, are making sure that they don't stay silent. And even for that, they risk their lives. So by an act as simple as going to somebody's funeral, they risk their life. An act as simple as honoring somebody who's been killed by the regime, by going to their grave, they risk their lives. And we have many thousands of people in prison right now who, many of whom don't stay silent even though they're in prison. So even though they are being held in solitary, denied access to any kind of communication with their family, they're being tortured, they have suffered rape and sexual abuse, they are writing letters to the outside world, they are pleading for Western countries not to appease the regime. So it seems that the United States is saying that there's some kind of talking with the regime, and not using the word deal, but really what it looks like is another massive payment of ransom from the United States to Iran's regime for the release of just a handful of hostages. And we already know how that money would be used. The United States, unfortunately, has paid ransom to this regime in the past, and at the same time that the regime has received such injections in cash under JCPOA, Obama and John Kerry, they funded the war in Syria. Hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians killed because of the money that was provided to them by the United States. We have all the evidence that we need to know that that kind of appeasement only results in more human suffering and more security threats for the West. So my hope is that all Western nations are going to be honest with themselves, find a better way. Supporting the people of Iran is the best way to support security for the countries in the West. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to questions. I think you're muted.
You're correct. I think the term "you are muted" is the most common phrase in the last 2 years in the Western world. Miriam, that was great. The message wasn't great, but the delivery was great. Folks, if you want to ask a question, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please go ahead and type your question in there, or put your hand up, and we'll see if we can get you online. If you don't mind, Miriam, I'd like to start with a couple of questions. I want to dig down a little deeper on a couple of issues that you didn't really touch on, but I'm curious about it. And these may seem trivial, and perhaps they are, but is there in Iran a significant difference between the urban populations and the rural populations? And is it a case that the rural populations are likely to be, quote unquote, more traditional in their views and therefore more supportive of the regime? That seems to be the case in Turkey. And I'm just wondering whether there's any parallels in Iran with respect to that.
Yeah, we've had now protests in over 200 cities and towns in Iran, and the smaller towns and the rural areas seem to be just as angry and resentful as the big cities. I think a big reason is that the economics fuel these protests just as much as the aspiration for personal freedoms, social liberties, political rights, all of that, because economically people are really suffering, and they blame, just as people in Central and Eastern Europe blamed the communist regimes for their lack of economic opportunity, really economic exploitation that they were suffering. The people in Iran also do that. Keep in mind that there is really, really grotesque levels of corruption by a regime that claims to rule with a mandate from God and is holy. So the kids of the ruling elites are living in Western cities. They're driving around inside Iran with the finest of luxury cars, wearing designer clothing. And then, believe it or not, they post this stuff on Instagram so that people see. And it just is, I think, making people in rural areas who, as you say, maybe living or trying to live more traditional lives, more pious lives, really very angry, if not more angry.
Okay, interesting. So what's the state of... Oh, wait a minute. Hang on. I've got a question. I want to take that question. Let's see here. Yes. I don't know if you can see that question or not. The plight and fight of the Iranian and Afghan women is an inspiration for all of us. This is from a person who is an Afghan rights activist who fled from the Afghan government in 2021.
Yeah.
But how can the Iranian and Afghan diasporas work together to be the voice of each other, given that the similarities in the plight and fight are similar, so are the totalitarian oppressive regimes in both countries? How can Iranian and Afghan diaspora join hands in the West, particularly in the Americas? Do you think they can work together, or differences are a hurdle and will not be easy for both communities? I think that's a very interesting question. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Najaf Izad. I actually recently spoke at Princeton University with two prominent women's rights activists from Afghanistan, three actually, and we are working on these kinds of things. I think the affinity, the alliance is very natural. It's a very obvious one. There's a lot of respect there. The Islamic Republic has been absolutely horrible to the Afghan refugees living inside Iran. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, the ideology that rules over the people of Iran is the very same one that rules over the people of Afghanistan. The heartbreak is the withdrawal from Afghanistan was so badly handled. It caused so much the aftermath, the long-term effects of that withdrawal, I think, are profound, and they should be. I mean, the people of Afghanistan have every right to think that they were disrespected profoundly, and I don't think that Putin would have attacked Ukraine in the way that he did if the United States hadn't botched the withdrawal from Afghanistan so badly. But to the question, yes, we should be working together much more. We should be educating the West alongside each other. A struggle is one. And if one of us succeeds, then it will be so much easier for the other two. There are many countries in the region where the Islamic Republic has created almost an occupation kind of dynamic for itself, not unlike the Soviet Union in Central and Eastern Europe. It has satellite regimes, and in all of those countries, the regime in Iran is detested. So Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan too, there's a real understanding that it's the same thing that we're both suffering from. So yes, we need to come up with more creative ways, more effective ways to be lobbying Western governments to basically help us to liberate both our countries together.
Okay, excellent question, excellent answer. So, you know, we read the newspapers, we read the online stories about what is going on in Iran, but I don't know that I have a good understanding of sort of is there actually, for lack of a better term, an organized resistance as opposed to a popular resistance? You know, we obviously don't want names, addresses, and telephone numbers, but you know, are there groups that are actively working to overthrow the regime, and how are they organized? How are they doing that work?
It's such a good question. A lot of what happens in Iran is organic and spontaneous and natural, but so much else, I think, is obviously the result of a lot of painstaking organization. So labor protests, for example, are very hard to pull off without a plan, because you have to convince everybody, all the shopkeepers, for example, in a town, all the bazaari merchants, or all of the people who are truck drivers, or all the teachers throughout the country, the nurses at the main hospitals, farmers protesting environmental mismanagement. These people have to all be convinced. Therefore, there is a strong underground organization that manages to convince these people and gets their buy-in. In Kurdistan, where Mahsa Amini was from, there have been routine labor strikes, and again, that's indicative of a strong level of coordination and social cohesion. In Sistan Baluchistan province, another minority province in the south of Iran, Sistan Baluchistan, every Friday they come out and protest. When they walk to the mosque, they protest, and the imam there, again, a minority area, is openly against the regime. So there is a high level of organization in that regard. Having said that, the quote unquote political leaders outside of the country, some of whom have been active outside of the country for over 44 years, they are not as coordinated and united and in sync, and with a clear game plan, and with a real capacity to influence actions on the ground as they should be. And that's one of the biggest reasons that the revolution has not yet succeeded. Okay.
I think we have a question from one of our viewers, Diane Maddox. So please, Fanunda, if you'd be kind enough. Go ahead, Diane. Diane, I think you're still on mute. So maybe, Thanuja, can you take her off mute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Diane. Go ahead.
I'm very familiar with the Canadian Women for Afghanistan Women, and they tend to be very low key, and rather than infuriate the regime and put their families and themselves at high risk, they depend a great deal on the internet and again, clandestine delivery of the education information. And I appreciated your comment about getting or being ready, a level of preparedness, especially as in March, China brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so that they have they're bringing back their positive relationship.
Right.
I'm sure you're aware Saudi Arabia's crown prince was involved with, if he didn't organize it directly, there was an annual summit, an economic summit several months ago that included the world leaders of the larger economies such as China and the United States. So they were all meeting together. And I wonder if Saudi Arabia's presence increases with Iran, if that will in some way lower the tension and the environment within Iran that will facilitate the women, if they could just be a little bit patient and focus on the being ready for the transition to democracy or something that is similar to democracy, keeping in mind that Saudi Arabia would probably present as the big brother in the relationship. And the reason I'm suggesting that is because Saudi Arabia, with that organization, with the world leaders, that economic summit, if you will, was to push for the larger nations to support the smaller nations with economic development and advancement. They're very interested in global innovation. And while, yes, I'm absolutely aware of the horrors that are going on, I like to believe that there is hope in the diplomatic realm. Do you think that Saudi Arabia's influence as it grows may help to bring Iran closer, at least, to a democratic format? And I'll just make one other comment. With Afghanistan women, there was actually a group of women that, unfortunately for them, were in the press, but it's been quiet now. They managed to get out of Afghanistan, and they gathered in France when it hit the news, and they were trying to put a framework together for the new Afghanistan. So when you're talking about preparedness and ready for a positive future, I have thought immediately of that group, and certainly wish you all the best. But I'm interested in your comments about the relationship with Saudi Arabia and their focus for the future.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks for the question. As you know, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic is one that is very antagonistic. I mean, it's not a good one. So it's not as though they have rekindled a friendship. They have just, I think, decided not to be as bad with each other as they have been. Of course, the future remains to be seen. We don't know, but I'm reluctant to think that it's going to be a very good relationship, or at least not one very quickly that'll be good. Even if it is a very chummy relationship, that's not going to benefit the people, however. So Saudi Arabia, if it becomes closer to Iran's regime, Iran's regime is going to have a condition of the Saudis not doing anything to support the revolution. So that's going to be true with any government, any country that the Islamic Republic gets closer to, including the United States, their condition, the regime's condition is going to be silence about human rights, appeasement about human rights, guarantees for the survival of the regime. So that's going to be true with the United States. It's going to be true with European nations. It's going to be true with Saudi Arabia. So anytime this kind of regime gets close to another government, I doubt that it's an opportunity for improved freedom. I will say this, however, it does depend a lot on the policy that's in play from the Western countries. So, for example, Ronald Reagan got closer and closer to Gorbachev, but freedom was not only not sacrificed by getting closer to Gorbachev, talking more diplomacy, more direct communication between the two men. Reagan found new opportunities to press for example, immigration for Jews, release of dissidents, political openings, tear down this wall, that kind of thing. So it all depends also on who's in power and what the prevailing political mood is in the West. And unfortunately, right now, there's a lot of cynicism about the Middle East. There's an isolationist feeling on both the left and the right throughout Western countries. And when it comes to Iran, there has been a tremendous amount of solidarity. But when push comes to shove, unfortunately, Western governments not willing to cut off their economic and diplomatic ties and really sanction the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in particular.
Well, even though they have actually sanctions in place,
They have some, yeah.
There's some that, yes, but even with all of that, there are millions and millions and millions of dollars being pumped into Iran to create their various programs, like the drones that are being shipped to Russia for the Ukraine war. And it's not, nothing is instant at all. I'm just thinking about the 1979, the revolution, but we are still substantially advanced from that period, especially in the wonderful world of internet, and a lot can be accomplished through that medium, as I know that you're aware and you are working towards that. It can either go two ways. It can go to World War III if China, who brokered that deal in the first place, if China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran and Afghanistan and those regimes unite to the exclusion of the Western nations, that is pushing the world towards a nuclear war that nobody wants. And the reason I have hope is because Saudi Arabia also has a working relationship with the Western countries. And if any group, in my personal opinion, if any group is going to allow for peace, then they're the most, in my opinion, and based on everything I've read over all of these many years, I think they have the greatest chance of at least establishing some type of reasonable relationship, Cold War, but not pull the trigger. And that's an issue too, because Iran, you also know, is in a position, it'll be a couple of years down the road, but they are in a position to manufacture nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Diane, I'm going to have to cut you off here. I'm getting a backlog of questions. I'm sorry, you've had some good time there. Please mute. And could I ask a question from Aniat, please? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dan, for the opportunity. Thank you, Mariam, for an absolutely fascinating presentation. Just wanted to make a small comment from a perspective, from a security point of view. that the regimes like in Iran and the Taliban in Afghanistan, and I think from a security point of view, they are going to be very costly for the world.
Mhm.
As you know, following the collapse of the Afghan government in August 2021, at least 350 to 400 transnational and Al-Qaeda commanders moved back to Afghanistan. Around 35,000 to 40,000 members of these terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, are back in Afghanistan. There are reports that Iranian regime has ties with Al-Qaeda and housed some of their commanders and members in Iran. Al-Zawahiri, the second man in Al-Qaeda, was hit in the heart of Kabul. He was housed in a villa of the Taliban's interior minister. So I think before it's too late for the world, for the West, containing regimes like the Taliban, of course, and Iran, is a responsibility. Is, I think, a moral responsibility. Look at all these crackdowns that the Taliban have put on Afghan women. They have erased 20 million Afghan women from public space. They are not being able to go to school. They cannot attend university, and a lot more. There is no freedom of expression. The Taliban's intelligence detention centers are full of Afghans, educated Afghans coming from different walks of life. So just wanted to make this a small comment that I think this is a responsibility, a joint responsibility of the West and international community. Before it's too late to take and contain regimes like the Taliban and Iranian regime and others that who have done so much things for deprive the human beings, from their basic rights, like Afghan women. Thank you.
Islamic fundamentalism is a cancer, and if we let it grow in Afghanistan, but say we're successful in defeating it in Iran, we haven't won. And wherever it remains, as Martin Luther King says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Islamic fundamentalism, even if it remains in just a small part of some part of the world, it will grow back. And that's why a holistic policy is necessary from the free world. We can't just defeat it militarily. We can't just defeat it by taking on these regimes diplomatically, let's say, in facing down the nuclear program. We can't just sanction our way there. We can't just do it by supporting the people on the ground. All those things together are what is going to ultimately defeat this ideology. And being very honest about the fact that we want to defeat this ideology. We were very honest about the fact that we were out to defeat communism. We shouldn't be embarrassed to say that we think that an ideology that subjugates women and girls, that sustains itself through killing and torture, is something that needs to be exterminated. We should take pride in that. I haven't talked about Israel. I think Israel's role is very important. I would love to see Israel be more overt and not just its kinetic response to the nuclear program, its assassination of nuclear scientists, its espionage of the nuclear program, its plants within the regime, its cyber attacks, its sabotage operations. Israel is going to be much, much more effective in taking on its enemy number one if it gets serious about the fact that the Iranian people are the key to a secure future. The Iranian people, supporting the Iranian people to have a democratic future is the number one way that Israel can secure its own future.
Thank you, Miriam. Eric, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Pardon the sirens in the background. It's a wild neighborhood. Miriam, I come at this from a slightly higher and more pessimistic level, like about 100,000 feet. But looking back over the past 70 years, it's notable to me that I don't think there's any, and somebody please catch me if I'm wrong, I don't think there is any totalitarian regime that has not been overthrown by conquest. I'm thinking Nazi Germany, I'm thinking Japan, North Korea was fought to a standstill, which is interesting. But I am seriously pessimistic about this being accomplished in Iran without outside help. And in fact, the Shah, you can quote catch me on this one. The Shah wasn't overthrown from within. The Ayatollah had to return from France to spearhead a revolution, and I would like to know more about that process, because of course Lenin returned from the Finland station to the Finland station in 1918, but that's down to the Germans. So let's assume for a moment that I'm right, and you can certainly tell me if I'm not. Where do we see this coming from? Because my feeling is that as long as you have the technology and the weapons and the will to commit unrestricted murder on your own people, you can survive.
Yeah. So first of all, I do think that the Central and Eastern European states were communist, were totalitarian, and they were overthrown by nonviolent civil movements. Now, the situation was quite different because the Soviet Union was weakened. It was not being appeased by Reagan, quite the contrary, and it had decided to pull back from its satellite states. So the people in those countries felt much more empowered to take on those regimes that they never thought were of their countries, of their culture. But those states were totalitarian states. I mean, when Havel describes the society, it's clear that that was a totalitarian state. And in fact, Havel and his writings are very popular in Iran today. Havel, people like the Soviet dissidents, Sakharov and others, and the labor strikes, in Iran really look to what Solidarity did in Poland also. But obviously, I agree with you that if we could have outside help, it would be better. And I'm not for an invasion of Iran, however, at the same time. So what kind of outside help are we talking about? I mean, I have actually talked about the necessity of just war, and the regime has taken that as wonderful opportunity to paint me as a warmonger. But the answer to your question, I think, is that the people of Iran are not just composed of those who are not in the regime. People who work for the regime are also the people of Iran. And other than those who are directly responsible for repression, there are many people in the ministries, even in really all parts of the regime. It's possible to see that they come to side with the people and against the forces who are responsible for violent repression. I say that because there is nothing else. There's no other way. The only way that there can be a peaceful transition inside the country without foreign intervention, as you mentioned, is for the people who are still willing to stay silent, to speak out, to come out onto the streets, including those people who are currently still working for the regime.
Thank you, Miriam. Dan, if I may, for a moment, I'm going to take issue with you on the question of Eastern Europe, although I'm not going to dive into it. But I was around for that, and I did my academic work in Soviet and East European studies. And those regimes, yes, they were totalitarian, but they collapsed like a house of cards the instant that the Soviet hand was removed from over them, which is directly why we have Putin. He was there, he saw the humiliation of his power structure, and he went back home and made sure it would never happen again in his country. Incidentally, the third example I was groping for after Nazi Germany and Japan was Saddam Hussein, who fought Iran unsuccessfully for 8 years, and then was defeated twice in Gulf War I and Gulf War II, but he was removed by the Americans and nobody else. So those are my only final points.
Thank you. I agree with that.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, I get the privilege of asking the last question, partly because other speakers have already asked some of the questions that I was going to ask, so that's a good thing. But Miriam, what do you think, if you can answer this question? I know you're not a Canadian and you don't live in Canada, but what would you like to see Canada actually do in a concrete way that would support the cause that you are so passionate about?
I'd like to see the government of Canada list the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its entirety as a terrorist organization, call it a terrorist organization. That would mean that it would need to kick out of Canada a large number of people who are working for the regime but living in Canada. And I would like to see the government of Canada proceed to sanction, as an extension of calling the IRGC a terrorist entity, up and down that institution, the people who are responsible for brutalizing the Iranian people. And then finally, to take on some creative democracy promotion activities, grant making, supporting of free press institutions, diplomatic rhetoric in support of the Iranian people, to basically make it a priority, make it an intention for the government of Canada to reflect what I think is the will of the Canadian people for a democratic Iran, to help the people of Iran to achieve their dream of a democracy, for the government of Canada to say, yes, we're going to do that. Yes, we're going to help these people to achieve their own goal. The Iranian people are capable and very highly motivated to do all the work that's required. What they just don't need, desperately don't need, is for governments in the West to continue to treat the regime as if it's a normal regime, to continue to do business with it, and to continue to engage with it, make diplomatic deals with it, and to continue to see the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as just another government institution, when really it's a terrorist entity.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I think this is something that's going to give our members and viewers and guests a lot of things to think about. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think the Iranian people, and particularly Iranian women, must be very, very grateful for the work that you're doing, and we wish you success in that regard, because I do think you're right. I think Canada, as a country, obviously wants to see a free and democratic Iran, and it is entirely consistent with what we consider to be our Canadian values. Right. And we need to do our part. So thank you for those suggestions and those ideas. I appreciate that very much. Let me then, if I may, start to wrap this up. I have people to thank. Thanuja, who makes all things possible behind the magic screen, the Wizard of Oz. She makes it all happen. So thank you, Thanuja. Eric, for helping with the communications piece. And of course, Eric will be posting Miriam's presentation tonight. It'll end up on our YouTube channel fairly shortly, I think. And I suspect it will be referenced a great number of times. You, the viewers who sign on for these events, and as I said, we have lots of folks who see these events globally after the fact because maybe timing is not convenient. And of course, Mariam, yourself, thank you so much for taking your time to do this. I'm glad we can help to get your message out there to the extent we are able. And it's an important message, and we're very pleased to do that. And as I said, my offer for you to be in Toronto at any time, let me know, and we would be happy to host you at the Royal Canadian Military Institute.
So kind. Thank you so much again.
Okay, you're very welcome, and we're very pleased to have had you. And folks, signing off now. Our next event will be in September. We're still finalizing a couple of details, so I don't want to make announcements that I have to go and renege on. So I would prefer not to do that, but you'll be seeing us again, both online and in person, starting up in the fall. In the meantime, please try to have a safe and great summer.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.